read verses 1 through 6 before we get started. Karen, can you read that for me, please?
Yes. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder and rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake.
Okay. So remember, we talked about last week, the chapters and the verses are not original to the text. When John sat down and wrote his gospel, his revelation, he didn't do the chapters. Personally, I think they made a mistake. I think when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. This really belongs in chapter 7 because he has done his 7 signs, this first cycle of signs. You get the four so-called horses of the apocalypse. Your 7th or your 5th sign is the martyrs underneath the altar crying out, "How long?" Your 6th sign, you have an earthquake. You hear the day has come. You have an interlude with the church militant and the church triumphant. And then you're waiting for the 7th sign. You're waiting for that last shoe to drop. And the Lamb opens the 7th seal and you get silence. It's very dramatic. We'd call this a cliffhanger. And then he changes directions. Then I saw 7 angels standing before God with 7 trumpets given unto them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer. Now I have 3 pages of notes about who these angels are, who these angels could be, who these angels are supposed to be. We really don't know that much about it. We get a list of angels from the apocryphal book in Tobit. We get another book of angels, list of angels from Enoch chapter 20. There are only 2 angels in the Bible who actually are named unto us in the first place. You have Michael and Gabriel. But then you've got, it's just theory after theory after theory about these angels of the presence and where they come from and what do they mean. Let's just say God's got lots of angels and they all have jobs. And we'll leave it at that. The sounding of the trumpets in chapter 8, verse 2. And then I saw the 7 angels standing before God with 7 trumpets given unto them. In the ancient world, trumpets are not really so much of a musical instrument as they were more like beepers. Trumpet's very loud, it's very brassy, it fills a space. It was prone to be used for civic signals, especially with the orders of war. In Numbers chapter 10, verse 1 through 10, the trumpets are used to call the Israelites to assemble before the tabernacle. It's a signal for the camp to move, a reminder that Yahweh of his people were in war so that he could save them. In the festival of worship, the sacrifices, so that Yahweh could remember his people. But particular, the trumpets are referenced to the announcement of eschatological events. In Isaiah chapter 27, verse 13, the blowing of the trumpet heralds the promised deliverance of Israel. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 14, the sound of the trumpet attends to the appearance of the Lord's judgment against his enemies, against the enemies of Israel. The sounding of the trumpet serves to draw attention unto the coming judgment of God over the wicked. It also signals the coming salvation for us. At that second coming of the Lord, the angels will be sent out, and they will be blowing the trumpets, and the trumpets will gather the elect from the 4 corners of the world. We'll hear the trumpets. The trumpet sound will accompany the resurrection of the dead as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 52, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. But before we get the blowing of the trumpets, another angel shows up. This new angel with a different job is going to offer up prayers. Verse 3, he says, "And another angel stood before the altar of the golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of the saints, and the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rise before God from the hand of the angel." So before the 7 trumpets even begin, another angel enters stage right. He takes a liturgical position before the altar. This is not the altar of sacrifice. This is the burnt offering altar. The incense, which has the purpose of attending to the prayers of the saints, right? So you get this Old Testament feel of being in the temple, and you had the big altar in the middle where you would offer the burnt sacrifices, but on a side altar is the incense altar. And as the incense smolders and burns, you get this wafting up of this smoke, this sweet-smelling smoke of incense. This is what the Old Testament thought of as the prayers coming before God. And in Hebrew, that's sort of the way it sounds.
So just to clarify, this is not the burnt offering altar. This is the incense altar.
It is. It's the incense altar.
Yes. Okay. Because you called it the burnt offering altar. So I'm just clarifying for the people online.
Well, I can't read.
We all knew what you meant, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is the incense altar, right? So the prayers of the saints are burnt on the incense altar, and it's a sweet-smelling aroma before the Lord. This is the way Hebrew talks about it, is that they waft up into the nostrils of the Lord, and he smells their prayers. They're a sweet, fragrant offering unto the Lord. So the angel fills the censer with fire, and he pours it out upon the earth. Now, this is important because we've got to talk about English just a little bit. This is a perfect tense verb, and it heightens the drama of the scene and indicates an action, but it's not just an action that happened. It's not an action that's going to happen. It's an action with a permanent effect. It happened and is still in effect, right? When I say that my daughter has learned to drive, right? That has happened, and it is a continuing bailment within my family. It just keeps going. She just keeps driving everywhere she goes, right? This angel takes the fire from the altar, from the incense altar, and he pours it out on the earth. The result is an action that continues after the angels sound their trumpet and indicate the scenes of the second earthly vision. Then an angel empties his censer and casts fire upon the earth. Now, the important thing to remember here is this angel going over to the incense altar, and he picks up his brazier and he pours it onto the earth, is to remember that when angels do things in heaven, it is a supernatural event, right? This is not something that is reflected upon natural man, right? The 4 horsemen are naturally occurring things on the planet, and that's why they're used horsemen. This is not a horseman, this is an angel. It is a supernatural act of judgment. A similar action is recorded in Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 1 through 8. Remember, everything in the book of Revelation comes to us out of this Old Testament theology. Everything is found in the Old Testament. If you have something in Revelation you don't know and you don't understand, you go back to the books of the Old Testament. Don't go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book about it. They don't know. The Old Testament's where you're going to find your answer. In Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 1 through 8, Ezekiel sees a man dressed in linen who commanded by God to go out among the cherubim of God's heavenly throne and fill his hands with coals of fire. He is then to scatter the burning coals over the city of Jerusalem. The scattering of the burning coals indicates God's judgment and the resulting punishment and the suffering thereby, right? God is going to punish Israel, and so he heaps burning coals upon the city. As this angel pours out the supernatural fire from heaven, there's also comes natural calamities of thunder and noise and lightning and flashes and earthquakes. The thing we're supposed to remember here is that this is not natural. This is a supernatural, or at least a not natural judgment. Let's read verses 6 through 13. That's the rest of the chapter.
Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire, mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water, because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blasts of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow."
So, after the priestly action before the incense altar, and after he empties the incense censer of its fire upon the earth, the 7 angels, with their trumpets, get ready to do their work. The prayers of the saints have been offered as sweet incense, and now God will answer the pleading of his people. The plagues introduced and ushered here by these first 4 trumpets are reminiscent of the features of judgment and the plagues that struck Egypt in Exodus chapter 7 through 10. Our first plague is on it is the earth. The first angel blew his trumpet, and it followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burnt up. A third of the trees were burnt up, a third of the grasslands were burnt up, fire and hail having been mixed with blood. This is clearly not a natural phenomenon. You will see it as being a supernatural phenomenon, but only if you have the eyes of faith to see it. We say that all the time. Every year, California gets set on fire, and you go, what is going on with California? God is so mad at it. The same thing with New Orleans. It seems like every time we turn around, God is drowning New Orleans. These are things that we kind of joke about, but they're also the kind of Old Testament smitings that you would see if they were the enemies of us, right? So California gets lit on fire, and people are like, oh, what's going on? Well, maybe it is judgment on God, but you can only see that with the eyes of faith. A third of the earth's vegetation here is burned and ruined. Now again, this is an apocalyptical symbol. A symbol of a third suggests a partial destruction. It's not a total destruction. It's not a total loss, right? If a third of your house is burnt down, it's still a really bad day. But it's not a total loss, right? You got the places that have been burned, and maybe it's sort of redeemable. The expression of third appears in the Old Testament quite often. Examples of this, Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 8 through 12. God tells the prophet that because of his judgment of Jerusalem, a third of the population is going to be killed by famine, and a third are going to be killed by a sword, and a third will be scattered under the wind. This prophecy of judgment is introduced by Ezekiel performing a symbolic action of dividing the hair shorn from his head into 3 parts. A third of it is burnt, a third of it is struck by the sword, and a third of it is scattered into the wind. Here, in Revelation chapter 8, the idea of a third of these things being destroyed is symbolic of the fact that at any moment, one of these 4 great parts of creation can suffer and can be decimated right before our eyes. The expression of a third happens throughout this entire second cycle, because we finished the first cycle, right? The first cycle with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We closed that out with a period of silence, and then we start the cycle over again. Whereas the four horsemen of the apocalypse are naturally occurring days of the Lord, these are not natural days of the Lord. While the first four plagues, seemingly natural, but not really strike the earth directly, humanity is not affected, right? When a third of the seas are destroyed, humanity is affected because we depend upon the sea, but it's not specifically targeted at us. If a third of the land is destroyed, we suffer because we're dependent upon the land. The same thing with the air. We're dependent upon the land, the sea, the rivers. It gets worse after you get through the first four cycles. Symbol 5 and 6, that comes right at us. All right, let's go to the second trumpet. Chapter 8, verse 8 and 9. The second trumpet, or the second angel blew his trumpet, something like a great mountain burning of fire thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now we're talking about a third, we're talking about a symbolic number. It's not like the world had 58 billion ships and exactly 1/3 of those ships were destroyed. Chances are it's the ships that are in that ocean at that time. The second trumpet, second angel, we see a gigantic mountain of burning fire cast into the sea. I think of an asteroid. And if we do get hit by a really big asteroid, everybody will point to this and they'll go, look, here we are on our, and then they'll go through and they'll recalibrate all of the end days according to this one natural event. This natural event, but not natural, strikes one of Earth's three oceans, sending such a mass that we could readily describe it as a burning mountain. A third of the sea's creatures perish, a third of the ships are destroyed, a third of mankind's commercial activity is affected. It's somehow reminiscent of the first plague that struck Egypt with the plague of blood. All of the rivers in the body of Egypt were turned into blood, the fish died, and the water became undrinkable. If we have some sort of an asteroid thing that hits in the ocean, it's going to destroy a part of the oceans. When I think of oceans here, we're thinking about those saltwater bodies of water, as opposed to the next sign, which is the rivers, which are the fresh waters. For the third trumpet, number 8, the third trumpet blows his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and the springs of the water. And this star's name was Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Read, a great meteor flashes across the sky like a burning torch. It strikes the rivers and the springs, that is, the fresh bodies of water. As a result, the fresh water of the earth is made embittered, made unfit to drink, perhaps even poisonous. The star suggests not only that this is a place of natural origin, meaning the sky, but it's also metaphorical that the origin from the judgment which appears from the stars. Again, it's a naturally occurring event, but it has this idea of this divine justification, this divine punishment that's been sent upon man. Remember, a third of the waters can mean, according to God's promise, it permits it, but there's also a limit to these plagues, right? So all of the waters could be destroyed, except God limits the punishment at this place. It's not all of the fresh water on the planet of Earth. It's only a part of the fresh waters, okay? And even if just a part of our fresh waters are polluted, that still means a great deal of suffering, pain, death, and famine. Again, it's not that the waters affect us specifically, but we're affected by our environment. We get to the fourth trumpet. The fourth trumpet blows, or the fourth angel blows his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, and a third of the light might be darkened. The third of the day may be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. The sound of the fourth trumpet and a third of the heavenly bodies are struck so that they are unable to give their full light and brightness unto the earth. See as well Job chapter 9, verse 7. It's difficult to relate this partial darkness unto the human experience. I mean, we all know what it's like to have an eclipse of the sun or the moon. This is sort of common sense. We know how this happens. But there are also extremely small, and these eclipses are very, very narrow in focus. And in fact, if you're not paying attention, you'll miss them. I remember a couple of years ago, we had this big eclipse here in Charleston, and we were right in the center of it. It was going to be great, and then it rained, and I didn't get to see any of it. It did get dark, but you're like, oh, dark. I kept thinking this is the worst eclipse ever. And then the light came back and it was gone. It was like 30 minutes. It was just sort of, this is a lot like it. It's a natural event. It's a natural darkness, but if you have the eyes of faith to see it, it's not quite that natural because it's got a third of the sunlight. The inability of the heavenly bodies to produce their full light for the benefit of life upon earth. This might also result, say, from a nuclear fallout. It might also result from pollution by a byproduct of some mega volcano that took out the Pacific Ocean, or some sort of mega volcano that took out the Great Lakes. This partially darkening of the heavenly bodies points to the end when it is no longer possible to repent. God's darkness sent upon the earth is always in the Old Testament seen as a coming to the end of the light. And when darkness comes, the light goes down. And with the fading of the light, you have a fading of time to repent. The candle is short. Time has run out. People's lamps are running out of oil. Remember the parable of the foolish virgins? They don't bring enough oil, and they're like, oh, we need more oil. And the lamps just start going out one at a time. We're getting close to the end. As we get close to the end, we get this eagle in mid-flight. Chapter 8, verse 13. And I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell upon the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. So you get these four signs. We get a repetition, right? We had the four horses of the apocalypse that had their very real and very natural events, right? So we had the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We had the horsemen of enforced peace, the horsemen of war, the horsemen of inadequate commerce, and then the horsemen of death. Again, we have the same sort of pattern coming here, with a third of the earth being destroyed and eaten up, a third of the seas destroyed and chewed up, a third of the fresh water chewed and eaten up, and a third of the sun is being chewed up and taken from us. But it's about to get worse because these four only deal with our environment. Number 5 and number 6 comes right at us. These partial darkness of heavenly bodies, together with the plagues of the first 7 trumpets, anticipates a transition for a divine warning. By the way, these natural disasters become demonic woes in 5 and 6. To emphasize the transition from natural calamities to those of demonic calamities, and then unto the end itself, this eagle flying at the highest point of heaven cries out in a loud voice for all to hear, woe, 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 to those who dwell upon the earth. So horrible and terrifying are these scenes of the last 3 angels that we call them as shorthand the woes. Like we talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, we get to the end of the second cycle and we have the 3 woes. In Revelation chapter 14, 6 and 7, such an angel does fly in mid-heaven and cries out in a loud voice. However, the angel in 14, 6 and 7 proclaims not only judgment, but also urges the people on earth to worship God as their creator. he is the eternal gospel to be proclaimed by all people. It's interesting that we see this eagle in flight who's going to introduce these supernatural woes, these three supernatural woes that are coming upon the earth. And then that will move us into chapter 9. And we'll stop the video.